So I want to continue talking about labor unions. A few things to share with you. We're going to talk about something called the Wagner Act. Even though it's an old act, I would argue that it is probably the single most important act governing labor relations in the United States. But I also want to talk about a few other things. At the end of the last video, we talked about the fact that in the early 1900s, labor unions weren't very powerful. There was certain attitudes in society, and the legislative climate was such that unions didn't have a lot of rights. There was an idea that sprang up in the early 1900s. It came from Frederick Taylor. Some people call it scientific management. That's what Taylor called it. Some people call it Taylorism. So this was a way that firms would say, look, let's try and get greater productivity by standardizing of the work process. What would happen here is firms would do what were called time and motion studies. They would study a process and try and figure out, okay, what is the best way that we can do this job? And the idea was if you could figure out the best way to do the job, then you would determine every worker's marginal revenue product. So this was a quote from Taylor. I love this quote. The laws of the workplace, scientifically based, are no more subject to bargaining than the strength of steel. So the idea here is, under scientific management, Taylorism, firms don't have to bargain with workers because what we see is we can figure out the best way of doing something. Once we figure out the best way of doing something, we know exactly what the contribution of each worker is, and that's what we pay them. When I was in college, I actually worked in a steel mill for 2 months, and they had people that went around with stopwatches and clipboards, and they would time every process. I had to change the wheel on an abrasive saw that cut through steel, and they would time how long it took me to do it, and they would try and figure out what's the best way to have people do this. Now, the reason I mention this, even though it's 100 years old, this actually evolved into something called Kaizen. For those of you with an interest in Japan, and I know we have some in the class, Edward Deming, an American, developed this idea much later in the 40s and 50s, and it was actually pioneered by Toyota during, right after World War II. So the idea of this cycle is what you do is you make a plan. And you figure out, okay, how am I going to improve my product? And then what you do is you conduct an experiment, you manufacture using that, you see what the results were, and if the results were favorable, then you adopt it permanently. And then you come up with another plan, and you figure out, you conduct an experiment to figure out if it works. So you can imagine a situation on an assembly line where what might happen is you might have two workers, each one puts the bolts on a wheel and then takes one of these guns and puts it in there, and it twists the bolts on so it secures the tire to the wheel. And maybe they try an experiment. They say, okay, what we're going to do is we'll have one worker put the bolts on, and the other worker just takes the gun and gets the bolts tightened. Which works better? So this is what's known as continuous improvement. And the reason I mention this because this actually has evolved into what we call lean management. And our folks over on the business side of the house, the business side of the department, they brought in somebody to teach a course in lean management. This was actually developed by it was extended by a firm who wanted to have production be so good it would be within it would be so good there were 6 standard deviations better than normal. And a standard deviation, the abbreviation is a sigma. So if you've ever heard in the business world 6 sigma, and that is something that they really do have in the business world, it really goes back to Kaizen, which really goes back to scientific management. So it's not part of collective bargaining, but I thought I'd teach you a little bit about the real world. So what we see is in the 30s, this was the big area where unions grew. Now the key thing that caused them to grow was the Wagner Act. This is also known as the Labor Relations Act, and it was passed in 1935. So what did the Wagner Act do? Now, originally, before the Wagner Act, firms could discriminate against union members in hiring and firing. So what would happen is, if they knew somebody was a union member, they say, okay, we're not going to hire you. Or if they found out somebody wanted to join a union, what they would do is they would fire that person. This would keep the union very weak, and management wouldn't have to bargain with them. Now, I put in this picture of a yellow dog because, to give you an example of some of the power that management had, there was something that was called, this was the name, a yellow dog contract. And the idea was that a worker, upon taking the job, had to sign an agreement that said, I hereby pledge never to join a union, and if I do, you can fire me. Now, this will keep a union very weak. Now, unions said only a yellow dog would sign such a contract. I have no idea what's wrong with yellow dogs. This is a term that sometimes you hear. People used to describe themselves as yellow dog Democrats. And the idea was that I would vote for the Democratic candidate even if they ran a yellow dog. I've never figured out what's wrong with yellow dogs, but it's a derogatory term. This was actually made illegal even before the Wagner Act. But despite those contracts, even if you didn't use a contract, you could still fire somebody because they were a member of a union, or you could fail to hire them. You would refuse to hire them because they were a member of the union. The Wagner Act said no more. Now, you could also, before the Wagner Act, discriminate against union members in promotion and assignment. So if you're going to promote somebody, you'd say, okay, this person belongs to a union, I'm not going to promote them. The other person doesn't, yep, I'm going to reward them. If this is the case, as you know, economists love to say people respond to incentives. If you see that you won't get promoted if you join a union, you won't join a union. Or when I worked in that steel mill, the worst job I ever had in my life was there was this cooling pool. They ran the water over the steel. It picked up pieces of steel filings, and they would spray it in what looked like a big swimming pool. And there was literally 6 inches of metallic sludge in the bottom. And they put us in there because there were pipes. They couldn't put in a machine. They gave us shovels, and we had to shovel sludge into a backhoe loader. If you don't want people to join a union, give them that job. Now, the Wagner Act also said firms had a legal obligation to bargain in good faith. This does not mean that firms must agree to what the union asks for, but they must bargain, and they must bargain in an attempt to reach an agreement. So if management says, look, we're going to make you one offer, you take it or leave it, the government has said that is not bargaining in good faith. So you have to sit down with the union and attempt to reach an agreement. You have a legal, this is important, some of you will be in management. If there's a union, you have a legal obligation to bargain with it in good faith. You can't hire spies to infiltrate the union. So one of the workers in Cut Loose talked about how, they hire spies so they know exactly what the union is going to do. Hey, is that legal? No. Is it done? Yes. People violate the law. You can't bribe union officials. So if management says to the president of the union, tell you what, if you lower your demands, we'll give you individually $10,000 in cash. That would be a bribe. You can't do that. Also, you can't form a company union. In other words, management, the owners of a company, can't form a union that the company controls. Unions have various things. They provide things like a pension plan for their workers. They provide health care. They have parties. They sponsor baseball teams, things like that. Union members, one union against the other. So management might say, if you want all those things, we'll form a company union. We'll make the vice president for human relations the head of that union. And the result is, hey, there'll be fringe benefits, there'll be parties, a 4th of July picnic, there'll be baseball teams, you can have it all. But the person that's the head of the union will be somebody who's reporting to the head of the company, and the result is it really won't bargain in the worker's best interest. Can't do that. It's illegal. And finally, it set up something called the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB. This is a 5-person panel. It has Democrats and Republicans on it. It's appointed by the president. Now, the NLRB does some very important things. It conducts a union representation election. What this means is, suppose there's no union. Give you an example. Honda over in Marysville, about 20 miles from Delaware, Ohio, didn't have a labor union. If 30% of the workers, join a labor union, the result is the NLRB conducts an election. If the union wins the election, 30% have to join to hold an election, but if the union wins 50% of the votes, this is the term that's used, certification, the union is certified as the bargaining agent for the union. What that means is now one union only, will be the official bargaining agent for the workers. They will be the ones that will conduct collective bargaining. And the firms have a legal obligation to bargain with the union in good faith. So now there's a process. If workers want a union, there's an election. Now if the workers say, you know, the dues are too high, we think the union is corrupt, they don't have to vote for a union. If it turns out they have the union and they don't want it any longer, the Wagner Act didn't have a provision to get rid of a union. Later laws gave an opportunity for workers to get rid of a union. Now, I'm going to bring in something you might think is tangential, the Sherman Antitrust Act. You probably learned about that in principles. And the Sherman Antitrust Act says it's against the law to be a monopoly or attempt to be a monopoly. It can't be a monopoly. It was interesting to note that the federal courts in the early 1890s ruled that unions were attempting to be monopolies. The first act of the Sherman Antitrust Act was not against a firm. By the way, the first firm that was broken up was Standard Oil in 1911, 21 years after the act was passed. About 4 years after the act was passed, it was used against labor. Some workers for the Pullman Railroad Company, they built railroad sleeper cars, went on strike. The workers withheld their labor. So the Pullman firm sued and said, look, they're attempting to be a monopoly. They're conspiring. They're getting together to withhold their labor, and that is against the law, and the courts agreed with management. Now, by the way, in 1940, the Supreme Court said, 50 years later, that's not gin, by the way. Okay, the Supreme Court said, look, this was never meant to be used against labor. So, this kept labor down for a while. Now, another thing that happened, originally, unions were what were called craft unions. A craft union means all workers who perform the same job are put in the same union. So in other words, there would be a union of all people that were painters, a union of all people that were bricklayers, a union of all people that were bakers. Actually, truth be told, my father was a member of the Painters Union. My grandparents were members of the Bakers Union. Now, these were generally skilled workers. The American labor movement originally was one of craft unions. And these craft unions in the 1880s formed a federation, the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. By the way, that was founded in Columbus, Ohio. And if you go down to High Street near Broad Street in downtown Columbus, you can see a plaque where they formed the American Federation of Labor. Now, in the 1930s, people said, if you go into a steel plant, you have people doing different jobs. You have some people are working in the steel mill. There are actually locomotives that are driving the material within the steel. They're there. You have people that are bricklayers lining the furnace of a blast furnace. You have people, that are carpenters building scaffolding. So instead of trying to have all these separate unions, let's put everybody in the same industry in one union. And if you hear of a union such as the United Auto Workers, the United Steel Workers, that's what's an industrial union. All the workers in the same industry. They formed an organization called the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Well, industrial unions proved to be a pretty good way of organizing labor, and for some cases, craft unions were a pretty good way. Now, there was a rivalry between these two, but finally in the 1950s, they merged, and you might have heard of the organization, the AFL-CIO. Next video, we're going to look at why this was the high point of unions and what happened since then. Take care.